Hello and welcome to lecture number 6 of Persecution and Anthropology of Witch Hunts. This week the lecture is entitled The Great Witch Hunt. I'm your lecturer, Dr Nick Herriman, anthropologist at Trobe University. In this lecture we cover aspects of the late medieval and early modern period that formed the backdrop to the Great Witch Hunt. We also consider various theories which purport to explain the Great Witch Hunt, including Cohen's idea about the conflation of witch and heretic. Now we'll start with the background. The suspicion and persecutions of witches in Europe appears to have a long history. The Bible, which forms the basis of the Judeo-Christian tradition, tells us, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." In other words, you shouldn't let witches survive. Numerous other biblical references also depict witchcraft and sorcery as odious to God. The suspicion of witches is also evident in ancient Greek, Roman, Germanic, and Celtic cultures. Furthermore, the fantasy of a secret society with anti-human practices preying on the wider society, which forms the backdrop to the European witch hunt, has its origins in classical or ancient Europe. Indeed, the ancient European penalty for committing murder by witchcraft was execution or exile. The historian Beringer provides us with more detail on this, but unfortunately for these early times, we have almost no idea of the extent of victimization which resulted from these suspicions and rules. The famous witch craze, or probably better to call it witch hunt, which gripped different parts of Europe, occurred over a period of approximately 3 centuries, 1450 to 1750. Triggered by a belief that an army of witches was preparing an assault on Christendom, the witch hunt was basically one very large judicial operation. Using techniques of torture, naming accomplices, and witch finding, something like 110,000 people, predominantly women, were persecuted for being witches. About half were executed, making for around 60,000 deaths. Ecclesiastical courts, that is church courts, initially undertook these prosecutions. However, from the mid-1500s, secular, that is non-church courts, became increasingly responsible. Historians have written much on this phenomenon and interpreted it in many different ways. So in this brief overview, I will give only what could be considered the general outlines of research on the topic. The Great Witch Hunt, in its initial stages at least, could partly be considered a continuation of institutions and traditions from the Middle Ages. In other words, the medieval period. The Catholic Church's crackdown on Christian heretics in Western Europe took the form of crusades and inquisitions against, in particular, the Albigensians and the Valdensians. The Albigensians, sometimes called the Cathars, advocated one of the great heresies of the Middle Ages. Now, it is easy to get our heresies confused, so to help remember the Albigensian heresy, remember it is formed in the town of Albi in the south of France. It's formed around the town of Albi, hence Albigensian. The Cathars, or Albigensians, rejected Catholic monotheism of the period, professing instead a dualism. They consigned the physical world we live in as the work of Satan or the devil. God, by contrast, was, according to their heresy, spirit and good. The elite of the Albigensians were perfects. Once initiated as such, the perfects renounced this world, longing in principle for death. Their life was somewhat less agreeable, being forced to abstain from meat and women. The ordinary believers, however, led a fairly agreeable life, but when approaching death, they embarked upon a total and suicidal fasting. Now, as I mentioned, it was based around Albi, which is a Mediterranean area in the south of France, and it spread over to what is now Italy. And the heresy appeared in the 1100s and was wiped out by the 1300s. And while the term crusade is usually used in conjunction with fighting against infidels in the Holy Land and in Spain, the Church actually organised a crusade against the Cathars in 1209. The Cathars, espousing a willingness to die, put up a stiff resistance apparently, but to little avail as they were slaughtered, and the movement survived only in isolated pockets into the next century, including parts of southern France and the village of Montaillou, which is the subject of the famous history by Laroy-Ladurie. Again, Laroy-Ladurie or Leroy-Ladurie, and his history of Montaillou. Okay, so that's the Albigensian or Cathari heresy. Another heresy also based in the area of modern France is the Waldensian heresy. This from the Encyclopedia of Religion. The Waldensians, also called the Poor Men of Lyon, or Lyons, originated with Pierre Valdès, or Pierre Valdo, a wealthy merchant of Lyon in France. He took a life of wandering poverty and preaching and living on alms in emulation of Christ's life on earth. He was soon joined by others who translated into French passages from the Bible for the group's use in preaching. Now, translating and preaching was a no-no, so he took his case to the Pope of the period, but the Pope said he was only allowed to preach if the local clergy allowed it. Not much chance of that, apparently. He and his followers were later excommunicated, and in 1184 this movement was condemned as a heretical sect and was persecuted in the southern France and then sought refuge in the Alps. As Cohen shows us, 1420s trials of Waldensians in the Alps were tinged by witchcraft allegations, and this starts to become a regular theme. For example, in 1438, Pierre Balin, a vassal of the Lord of Tournon, was tried for witchcraft. At the first trial, he confessed that he had given himself to a demon and rode regularly to a sabbat where children were eaten. Now, a sabbat is a witch's Sabbath, and this is a term we'll need to be familiar with. In the second trial, Pierre Balin provided names of 10 accomplices. Another example is the 1453 trial of Guillaume Adelin, a doctor of theology and professor. In this trial, quotes, attendance at the Sabbat, or as it is called here, the synagogue of Waldensians or witches is what mattered. Maleficia are barely hinted at. Maleficia means everyday acts of witchcraft. So here we can see that the idea of being a heretic, in this case a Waldensian, and being a witch who attends a Sabbat come together. And we are, according to Cohen, now getting to the beginnings of the Great Witch Hunt. In the 1459 trial of a hermit in Arras, another area in France, the authorities, who were convinced of the reality of nocturnal flight and the Sabbat, launched a mass trial after the hermit named others he had seen at the Sabbat. They confessed under torture, though they did retract under the flames. And this witch hunt in Arras involved some of the richest citizens. So there are a couple of things to say about these early witch trials. They are directed against elite men, and also witchcraft and heresy are conflated. Now, while these trials are relatively small scale, large-scale trials were already occurring in other parts of Europe from the 1430s, according to Beringer. So we are now into the Great Witch Hunt proper. And to describe this, I'm going to base the following discussion on historical accounts by various famous historians from the past 40 or 50 years. The first is one by the name of Caro Baroja, a Spanish/Basque historian who describes witch hunting in the 1500s in the Basque country. Now, if you don't know, Basque country is an area which borders Spain and France, particularly around the Atlantic coast. In 1500s, the witches of Amboto were women. They were thought to be experts in magic who worshipped the devil. An inquisition burnt 29 or perhaps more witches in 1507 in other parts of the Basque country. Then in 1527 in Pamplona, where they had the running of the bulls, 2 girls were suspected of being witches and identified, quotes, 150 other sorcerers and witches. The reality of these witches was attended to by one of the inquisitors named Avellaneda, who visited a witch who was to be tortured, and according to Avellaneda, quotes, "She anointed herself in the usual way with a poisonous ointment, and she went to a window which was in a high place, and then she called on the devil for help, and he came, as was his wont, and took her and carried away nearly to the ground." Avellaneda then describes how one of the men who was with him on the following Monday, how one of the men who was with him, terrified to see such a thing, began to cross himself and call on Jesus Christ. And at this, the devil disappeared, and so they both escaped. I found her and 7 others with her at a harbour town in a hut. So that's the account of one of the witch hunters, one of the inquisitors in the Basque country. I'll now move to an account by Ginsberg, another famous historian, who describes a famous case of witch hunting from Friuli, an area in northeastern Italy. Now, we're talking about the late 1500s here. The Benandanti believed, Ben means good, Andanti means walking, so the good walkers, but they're actually often called the night walkers. They believed that their spirits could leave their bodies while they were under a deep sleep. So that, if you saw a Benandanti leaving his or her body, they would appear to you to be deeply asleep. When they left their body, they would joust with witches to ensure good harvests, protect wine, protect against witchcraft, and so on. One of these Benandanti was a man named Gasparuto, who, being questioned by a priest, explained, on Thursday during Ember days of the year, they were forced to go with the witches to many places, such as the Cormons, in front of the church in Iasico, and even around the countryside about Verona. Further, the Benandanti fought and played and leaped about and rode various animals and did different things among themselves. And the women beat the men who were with them with sorghum stalks, while the men had only bunches of fennel. So as the Benandanti explained themselves, they were in their deep sleep, leaving their bodies and going fighting against witches. However, this priest who Gasparuto took him to see an inquisitor, and the inquisitors suspected them. And Gasparuto and another man, for example, another Benandanti named Mouko, were tried in 1581 by inquisitors and censured for idolatry and sin, but not heresy. Now, according to Ginsberg's analysis, this was a popular religion which was a survival of a pre-Christian agricultural cult. French historian Deserteur describes perhaps one of the most famous single incidents of victimization. This is associated with the possession of nuns in the French town of Loudun. These incidents were portrayed in Ken Russell's 1971 horror movie, The Devils, if you're interested, and also in Aldous Huxley's book, The Devils of Loudun. Quoting another earlier historian, Deserto notes that a man named Urban Grandier was a local, young and ambitious profligate priest. Quotes, he was tall and good-looking, always clean and well-dressed. He expressed himself with great ease and elegance. He was sweet to his friends, but proud and haughty to his enemies. Now, the nuns claimed that they had been possessed by him, the nuns in one of the local nunneries. And one of them stated that he, quotes, used demons, I should put on a nun's voice, used demons to excite love in me for him. They would give me desires to see him and speak to him. I burned with love for him. And when he presented himself to me at night in dreams and wanted to seduce me, our good God gave me a great aversion to him. As the affair developed, these nuns were publicly exorcised. They had the devil taken out of them by Grandier's enemy. Grandier was eventually tied and burnt at the stake. Macfarlane, an anthropologist and historian with a great webpage, which I would suggest you check out under Alan Macfarlane, provides a study of the 1645 Essex trials. Essex, of course, is an area east of London. These involved 50 indictments, with 36 women being tried or executed. The trials were different from earlier trials in as much as the abnormal proportion of executions, the geographical concentration, the presence of witch finders, and stories that the witches had entertained spirit familiars. Now, spirit familiars are spirits who you know quite well and often work in your service. The trials were also unique in as much as the special methods that were introduced to induce confessions, including pricking, by which process a sharp object was pricked all over the witch's body. And the idea was that if they were a witch, there'd be a part of their body that wasn't sensitive. I think that was the part of the body the devil entered through. So if they didn't scream when the pricker pricked the witch at a certain point, that would assure the pricker and the witch finder that they were in fact a witch. The other famous one is swimming. The idea with swimming is that if the water rejects them, it's a sign that God has rejected them, kind of like the opposite of a baptism. So you chuck them in the water. If they float, God or the water has rejected them, so they must be guilty. And if they sink, well, they were innocent. Macfarlane emphasises the intimacy in the relationships between the accusers and the accused. Quotes, "There is no doubt that witchcraft prosecutions were made between people who knew each other intimately. Very few accusations were made against people who lived far away. Thus, accusations seem to have been limited to the area of intense relationships between individuals. They were often from the same part of the village, occasionally being next-door neighbours." A common story seems that the neighbours made malicious remarks, but according to Macfarlane, what seems clear is that it was not the content of the remark which mattered, but rather the context in which it was spoken and the interpretation put on it. For example, some of the witches were either too generous or caring as neighbours, so they were thought to be hiding their witchcraft. The supposed motives of the witches also have to be viewed in terms of relationships between neighbours. As Macfarlane notes, a person was refused some small object and in her anger retaliated by bewitching the refuser. The sphere of neighbourly conduct was not merely limited to gifts. Even an action like removing a piece of wood from a muddy patch might be construed as unneighbourly and lead to tension. There are many great historical accounts, but these provide us with some idea of the form that the witch hunts took. So what is the larger picture of the witch hunt that we're provided with? Although the Great Witch Hunt began with the Church's concern to stamp out heresy, scholars generally agree that it is best understood in terms of the momentous changes associated with the end of the medieval period and feudalism. In other words, we have to understand the Great Witch Hunt as an early modern phenomenon. So why is this? In the 1300s and 1400s, the social structure of medieval Europe was breaking down. And we can see this in several aspects. First is church and state. In the medieval period, power had always fluctuated between the state, that is the kings, queens and princes of Western Europe, the wardrobe and courts they possessed, that's the state, and the papacy in Rome. Kings, such as famously King John of England, were sometimes excommunicated and often struggled to contain the priests in their own country. However, from 1300s, the balance begins to shift more decisively towards the state. For example, when relations between the papacy in Rome and the King of France broke down, the French king established popes in his own kingdom, the so-called Avignon popes. And into the 1500s, England's King Henry VIII established a separate church, the Church of England. So, to repeat, the balance between church and state is beginning to no longer just fluctuate and balance, but move towards, decisively towards the state. The second change, which is going to take over a bit later, is the balance between urban and rural Europe. Now, for many centuries, most of the population resided in rural areas. Life was determined by the sun. People would wake with the sun and go to sleep with it too. However, with the enclosure movement, that is a movement amongst landowners to turn the land into a commodity used to produce wool. In other words, you can't plant crops to eat here. I'm going to just have grass so my sheep can eat it. This forced the serfs off the land and into the cities. This starts in the 1500s. Another change that's going on is the distinction between literate priests and illiterate masses is changing. In the medieval period, an important distinction was between the clergy, being the literate class of intellectuals, and the masses, being illiterate and relying on the clergy. Put simply, the literate clergy held the key to heaven. The clergy in the countryside were cultural brokers, bringing the great tradition of the written documents, especially the Bible, to the little traditions of beliefs and fairies and goblins and so on to the countryside. With the invention of the printing press and the widespread publication of the Bible and the growth of literacy, this distinction was beginning to break down and will lead to the Reformation, which we'll talk about in a second. Another important social distinction which is beginning to break down is the distinction between aristocrats and the serfs. The general picture in the Middle Ages was that the lords of the countryside controlled the lives of the serfs who lived on their lands. There was a very small middle class composed of guilds, that is, apprentices, journeymen and masters, who resided in the cities. With the development of capitalism from the 1500s, a new merchant class develops. They're gaining wealth from the newly exploited New World of the Americas and through trade and pillage in Asia. Thus, as the witch hunt begins, this social order of the Middle Ages is crumbling. Indeed, far-reaching changes were occurring in Western Europe during the early years of the Great Witch Hunt. Renaissance, Reformation, exploration and capitalism were ushering in a new era in the history of the West. In the fields of science and discovery, Copernicus and Galileo reassessed humans' position in the universe. Explorers such as Columbus and da Gama opened up new worlds to European minds and to commerce. The religious wars of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation caused tumult. Economy and politics were also being reshaped by the growth of mercantile or merchant capitalism and the birth of the bureaucratic state. In general, this was a period of great dislocation and disruption. But what changes specifically are relevant to the witch hunt? Following the argument of the historian Cohen, 4 important developments lie behind the persecution of alleged witches. Number 1 is the legal change of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was an organization to combat heresy, which gradually took shape in the early 1200s. It was a set of procedures for the establishing of a church to deal with heretics, in particular the Cathars and the Valdensians. The courts of Inquisition had special powers. In addition to torture, judicial techniques of interrogation and naming accomplices were used. Actually, torture was not particularly novel. Rather, the judicial use of torture and ordeal against witches was merely a continuation of older patterns. Nevertheless, historians have questioned the importance of the Inquisition. According to Kelly, the idea of a single unified heresy hunting operation based in Rome is a myth. There was no presumption of guilt. Papal heresy judges did not have greater powers than other judges. Names of witnesses could not ordinarily be suppressed, and the person charged had the right to know the charges against them and the rights to defence. So the official procedure was fine, but the problem was not with the official procedure. Rather, zealous clergy bent the rules in the hunt for heretics. So we have two contrasting opinions on the matter. One holds that the Inquisition was an officially centralised persecuting movement. The other denies this. Regardless, the Inquisition could be seen as an attempt to stamp out heresy and subsequently witches. And at least in that sense, the courts of Inquisition form an important backdrop to the Great Witch Hunt. The second important factor was the rise of demonology. What is demonology? Basically, demonology refers to the study of witches by elite men, priests and scholars that is, in Western Europe around 1350 to 1650. The most famous among the studies was the 1486 Malleus Maleficarum. Malleus meaning hammer and Maleficarum meaning probably witches or witchcraft, so hammer of the witches. This important anti-witchcraft text was followed by 100 lesser works of similar content. So previously, the intellectuals of Western Europe had been suspicious or even skeptical about peasant superstitions, but now they took witchcraft seriously. Demonology, this new field of study, established the idea that witches were heretics who took part in worshipping the devil at Sabbats. Indeed, attending the Sabbat was the great crime. Along with a papal bull, a papal bull is like a papal decision from the Pope, which deplored the spread of witchcraft, Malleus Maleficarum is often seen as precipitating the Great Witch Hunt. But Cohen argues Malleus Maleficarum was not so important, as the witch trials had already begun as early as the 1420s and 30s, and this book was only written in 1486. So while we might have overrated the specific importance of these specific texts, most scholars agree that the general development of demonology, and particularly the conflation of witch and heretic, was crucial. And this conflation of witch and heretic is the third important change forming the backdrop to the Great Witch Hunt. Previously, witchcraft had not been seen as threatening Christianity. The term that was used, maleficia or maleficium, only referred to witches using spells against their neighbours. Nevertheless, during the Valdensian trials, for example, Valdensians were suspected not simply of heresy, but of a new style of witchcraft, the new demonological style of witchcraft, to be precise. As traditionally had been the case, they were thought to summon the devil, wherein later witch trials the devil presented himself of his own accord. But the notion of apostasy, of leaving the faith, of being a heretic, loomed larger. The idea was they were apostates, they had converted to the dark side, to the devil. And above all, this was described in terms of the Sabbat. So in pursuing the Valdensians, the authorities came across people who believed in the ideas such as cannibalistic infanticide, which had been said about them. And this contributed to a stereotype of a devil-worshipping, orgiastic, infanticidal, that is, child-killing sect. Or looked at the other way, the church had taken a new line on witchcraft. It was heresy. Thus, according to Cohen, two completely different notions of what witches were merged. There was a folk idea of witches as neighbourhood women, and there was the idea of the bishops and inquisitors. Theirs was a demonological idea by which a witch was above all a member of a secret conspiratorial body organised and headed by Satan, and the witch was a person who attended Sabbath. Put over simply perhaps, these two ideas combined to create a witch hunt. The Great Witch Hunt was driven by a sincere religious zeal, such that trials were seen as a battle between God and the devil. Another explanation links the Great Witch Hunt to the rise of the early modern state. Cohen describes the Great Witch Hunt as a massive killing of innocent people by a bureaucracy. As he put it, everything depended on the attitude of the authorities. Needing to create a new order, the authorities required a model of disorder, like a society of witches determined on the destruction of Christendom. Once the centralized states were consolidated, the authorities no longer had a need for this stereotype, and the persecution came to an end. The Great Witch Hunt was thus an exercise associated with state building. On the other hand, many of the trials were undertaken by local clergy or magistrates who were acting independently of the king or Rome. Briggs notes that witch persecution appears casual and sporadic, and only a handful of rulers or immediate servants took any known interest. Thus he contends that the Great Witch Hunt was not inspired and manipulated by the ruling elites for their own cynical purposes. Aside from Cohen's explanation, many other explanations of the Great Witch Hunt have been proposed. First, we will consider what we could call the gendercide theory. Instead of genocide, the idea here is that the witch hunt was directed against one gender, women. This is based on the idea that it was mostly women who were victimized, and among women, the Great Witch Hunt especially victimized those who deviated from the male-defined norm, that is, the old, the widowed, and the marginalized. Brain suggests that misogyny, that is, hatred of women, related to social structures, lies behind the Great Witch Hunt's persecution of women. Ben Yehuda, a sociologist, writes that in Western Europe during this period, quotes, "The growth of the proportion of unmarried women, prostitution, infanticide, and contraception were a complex of problems likely to arouse strong feelings. These conditions explain the suitability of a female symbol such as the witch to become an effective and central element in the demonological ideology. Furthermore, while the severe, even catastrophic changes provided by the intellectual cognitive background for the craze, its emotional zeal was made possible by focusing the tension, powerless, and anomie, that is social breakdown, and anomie on a relatively safe target, weak women. Women had an inferior status to begin with, and their lack of power and organisation rendered them ready for targets of widespread persecution." Another scholar, historian this time, Helixer, observes that poor women, especially widows, were perceived to be under the influence of the devil in Spain in the 1600s. Another theory is the rise of medicine theory. The basic idea of the rise of medicine theory is that the newly emerging profession of Western doctors sought to get rid of the competition in the form of traditional healers by accusing them of witchcraft. This is often combined with the gender-side theory that by holding that the traditional healers were actually women, and old marginal women at that. Nevertheless, the rise of medicine theory, according to Briggs, quotes, appears to be totally unfounded, for a painstaking check of all known British cases reveals precisely 2 rather dubious cases in England and 14 out of some 3,000 accused in Scotland. Thus, the theory of an emerging profession of doctors doing away with traditional healers is wanting evidence, at least in the UK or in Britain. Last lecture we looked at the witch cult hypothesis, which is advanced by Margaret Murray. This holds that victims of the Great Witch Hunt were people who adhered to the pre-Christian beliefs and self-identified as practitioners of magic. This hypothesis has been proposed by Michelet, Margaret Murray and others. Ginsberg, who we looked at earlier, depicting the people targeted in Friuli as self-identifying night walkers, provides a little evidence to support the idea. However, most current academic historians think the witch cult hypothesis is mistaken and misleading. Harris, for example, argues that some people dabbled in magic during this period, but these were not the ones who were targeted during the witch hunt. Harris, by the way, is a famous anthropologist who has another theory. His theory is that the Great Witch Hunt was an attempt to deflect criticism of authorities, such as was coming from the messianics of this period, by involving the population in a frenzy over non-existent witches. We're going to look at this in more detail later. Another theory proposed by the famous historian Trevor Roper sees the Great Witch Hunt in terms of the tension between Catholics and Protestants. In areas where the tensions were highest, the witch hunts were most violent, he says. So he sees it as the underbelly of the changes during this period. He also refers to tensions between the plains and the mountains. The plains where Christian beliefs were strongest and the mountains where pre-Christian beliefs were stronger. In this lecture, I provided an overview of the Great Witch Hunt. I've focused particularly on Cohen's analysis, but have also referred to some other analyses. Aside from Europe's burning times, the idea that first comes to mind when we hear the word witch hunt is Salem and McCarthyism. We will look at